You ever know someone who talked a big game, said they were the greatest at something, and then when the time came to prove it, turned out to be nothing but hype? Now, with people, you usually don't have a lot to lose if they're wrong. If a buddy says they can take anyone in a fight and they turn out to be a wimp and get their ass kicked, well, that's not on you. But when it comes to video games, I take it personally if I sacrifice several of my very precious leisure hours to play a game that turns out to suck. Now, Crash Bandicoot had a lot of hype around it when it came out, and honestly, I didn't play it at the time. I was busy with other games, but I always heard people telling me it was the best in the genre, groundbreaking, and destined to be one of the best PS1 games ever released. I guess at some point I started to believe it. So when I finally picked up Crash Bandicoot about a week ago to play it, I had pretty high hopes. I thought I was about to discover a brand new favorite, but when all was said and done, this game turned out to be all bark, no bite.
Nintendo video games.
Marry me with my money.
Now you're playing with power.
Crash Bandicoot was developed by Naughty Dog for the PlayStation 1 and came out in 1996. In a sea of awesome titles, word around the rental store was Crash was going to be the biggest game to hit the PlayStation hands down. People talked about its awesome gameplay, the great graphics, and just how much fun it was to play. Like I said, I didn't pick it up at the time, but I put it away in my mind as a legendary title I'd need to go back to someday. So lately when I was looking through some old titles to pick up for a review, along came Crash, and I've had a little time to reflect on things, and I feel like I got cheated, honestly. Like I must have played some other game than all these people were talking about. But I'm a thorough man, and I checked and double-checked. This was indeed the game behind all the hype. Now I know I called this video all bark and no bite, but it turns out bandicoots aren't much for biting in real life. I had to actually Google what a bandicoot was, because while I never heard of one outside of this game, I did know the general story of Crash Bandicoot happened in Australia. And everything in Australia can kill you, right? Well, it turns out a bandicoot in real life is like a 2-pound marsupial, so, another letdown. But about that story. I'll start by saying that while there is indeed a plot to Crash Bandicoot, it's not the kind of game where the plot matters all that much. And I think they knew that when they made it. Kinda like my review of Gunstar Heroes, this game's a lot more about the action than the story. Which is why if you even want to see the little story there is, you have to let the menu screen load for a bit first. Long story short, there's a mad scientist named Dr. Neo Cortex who's hell-bent on world domination. His plan is to use his Evolvo Ray and the local wildlife to build super soldiers. But it's not going so well, and our boy Crash Bandicoot's his latest experiment. When it predictably goes tits up, Crash breaks out and jumps to freedom, but he leaves another Bandicoot behind, his girlfriend Tana. At least we think she's his girlfriend, but since she's about 2 feet taller and a smoke show in comparison, who really knows? Anyhow, from there, Crash jumps right into action and starts going through the Wumpa Islands, defeating mutated monsters to get back to where he started and confront Dr. Cortex. Seems kind of like a silly thing to do to me, but I'm not a Bandicoot, so maybe I just don't get it. Should you avoid getting bored to sleep as you play the same 3 levels over and over and the repetitive bonus levels don't drive you nuts, you'll face some bosses that are about as threatening as a real-life Bandicoot. Get through them and you'll end up facing Dr. Nitrous Brio, sidekick to your arch-nemesis. Now once he's defeated, all that's left to face is Dr. Neo Cortex himself. It's important to point out though that if you didn't watch the whole story in the game menu, you wouldn't know anything about why you're fighting these guys, but it's the final battle either way and a pretty anticlimactic one. Now when all the bosses are defeated, you'll see the game's normal ending. That's where your big ol' girlfriend picks you up in her arms on top of the blimp you've been fighting on and the credits roll. Now there is a different ending you'll see if you manage to get all the gems throughout the levels in the game. It's no easy feat, let me tell you, so I understand giving you a little more ending to the story if you do pull that off. In that ending, each boss you fought has a nice little wrap-up story. Most move on to greater things, and Dr. Cortex is never heard from again. Either way, that's the story you get. And since it takes a lot of time and effort to get the gem ending, most people see the quick wrap-up where you save the day and get the girl and that's it. I don't have too many complaints about the ending since, like I said, this game's more about the gameplay than the story. But see, the gameplay is where the problems really lie. Before I get into anything else, the giant, obnoxious, unavoidable issue with the gameplay, in my opinion, comes from the camera. Well, the camera and the controls. and you can't control the camera, so like I said, it's unavoidable. The problem with the camera is that the angles are predetermined, so they often obscure upcoming hazards and make really precise jumps difficult. And precision is a big part of this game, because many of the levels you face are super fast paced, and missing a jump here or there means you die. I get that the graphics were meant to be pretty progressive for the time, but they weren't practically progressive, so it's already hard to tell what's safe and what's not to land on. And a bad camera angle makes that even worse. The controls themselves are tricky on their own too, because some parts of this game are incredibly difficult just based on how poorly you control Crash himself. Like I said, precision is important, and between the bad camera, the floaty jumps, questionable hitboxes, and did I mention the bad camera? It's just a non-stop frustration fest. This is all not to mention that some levels are side-scrollers, okay, easy enough. Some are shot from behind Crash, which, okay, I can handle that, but then you have some running toward the camera. You have no visibility to upcoming obstacles, and Crash doesn't exactly turn on a dime, so when you're outrunning a boulder Indiana Jones style, knowing what you're about to run into is really useful, but it's not an option. Keep in mind that Crash's moves include running, jumping, or a really unpredictable spin move. And since the spins are needed to get past certain obstacles and enemies, not knowing which direction you might be moving in or how far can make these things needlessly challenging. Most of what you're doing in this game is either jumping or spinning, and you get to a point pretty quickly where you don't feel much like you can rely on either one. And don't forget the level design itself. Because this thing seems to have been built for speedrunning first and enjoyment second, level design coupled with this lack of precise control means one toe in the water or one pixel off an edge and you're down. A touch too close to an enemy and you take a hit without contact. But if you're touched too far, you miss and they hit you with the air around them somehow. It's genuinely unforgiving. Fire's damage spreads way beyond the part you can see, so often just being near it sets you ablaze, and the spikes coming from walls, never-ending bat trains, and even just pits in the ground are all way more dangerous than they would be in a normal platformer with normal controls. The game has plenty of checkpoints, but they're generally placed really far apart, especially after really difficult sections. This means longer stretches every time you lose a life, which can be really frustrating. Now, one saving grace is that, at least for me, getting extra lives was never much of a challenge. There were plenty of times about halfway through the game and beyond where I maxed out my 99 lives, but they also go pretty quickly when you have to keep going back and redoing parts over and over because the mechanics are crappy. If it wasn't for the little mask power-ups you can collect that let you take a hit or two without dying, and they stack, which is nice, I'd say it'd be almost impossible to get through the full game in one stretch. There are, of course, bonus levels to consider though. The bonus levels are reached by collecting little icons from crates, either of Tana or of Dr. Nitrous, which give you different payouts. These are some of the only points you can actually save your progress in the game. But don't get confused, that saves the levels you've completed, not the gems you collect. Those you can save progress on by collecting a gem in a level, however, saving via gem doesn't save your level progress. You see where it's a little confusing? Now, all this considered, there's a reason this game's really well known. But I think it's got a hell of a lot more to do with how unfairly difficult and how poorly designed it was than the actual challenges built into it. But that's just my opinion. I won't spend a lot of time on the graphics, because I think I kind of already made my point on the effect they end up having on the gameplay, but I always try to be objective, so I can say that if you forget how they make the game harder, they're not that bad in terms of design. I did kind of like the jungle vibe they were going for, and some of the backgrounds are interesting. Now, if I put aside that the playability of the levels is obnoxious, there are some that have a unique look and feel, and that helps to break up the monotony of the repeating bonus levels and the generally repetitive jungle levels. Now, once you get into the boss territory or the actual boss levels, things definitely feel different. And I have to bear in mind that graphics at the time weren't that great, but you guys know I typically review retro games, so I'm used to graphics not being stellar. To me, artistry and design matters more, doing a lot with what you have, that kind of thing. And according to my research, production on Crash Bandicoot used $100,000 silicon graphic-based workstations, which were about 30 times as expensive as the personal computers that were the standard at the time in the industry. They also apparently over-designed a ton of the graphics initially, and had to reduce everything down to work within the PlayStation's limits, which kind of makes sense to me after playing the game. Like they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I respect that they probably wanted a much better, prettier, and smoother final result, but you have to work within your limitations from the start if you want to make a great game. And that's not what Naughty Dog did here. Just like having a great reputation doesn't make for a great game, having powerful hardware doesn't always mean a great set of visuals. And to me, the excessively polygonal feeling designs in Crash just don't look that good. And I guess they toyed with having a free-roaming camera too, but ultimately decided to go with the rail camera that just follows you around in the end. The good news is that the music in Crash Bandicoot's actually pretty good when you consider the fact that it wasn't even added to the game until just before E3. Not good enough to save my opinion of the game, but definitely interesting. Especially because the company they ended up going with in the end was founded by none other than Mark Mothersbaugh, who you might know is the founder of the 80s band Devo. The overall feel of the music is kinda tribal, ambient, and not super aggressive, which was a good call. Evidently they toyed with the idea of just using animal sounds at first, then put together a plan for some really intense and manic tunes just to match the game's energy, but they settled on the OST that we got, and I think it adds a lot to the game. So yeah, the graphics were overly ambitious and reduced in quality at the end, and the music was almost an afterthought. Given everything else I've said about this game, it sort of makes sense since the whole thing was hyped to oblivion, but the end result was kinda lackluster. Well, I think we've learned something today. Having a great plan and some big ideas is a wonderful thing when you're coming up with a game, but you have to stay grounded in reality and know what you're getting into before you actually start investing your time and energy into it. And that's honestly a lesson for us as gamers going into a title like this that we know has been hyped to the moon and back. Because as I've so often had to tell people in my professional life, frustration usually comes from unmet expectations. And sadly, that's what Crash Bandicoot turned out to be for me. High hopes and a pretty long fall. I'm not saying this is a bad game. I think I've shown it has some redeeming qualities, so feel free to go ahead and give it a try if you're interested. Just do yourself a favor and don't believe the hype. Naughty Dog might have put out some great games over the years, but this one is definitely all about the bark. And I think it kind of bites. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.